Good morning, evening to you, boss. This is your brother Disaster, and today's episode is so intense it'll give you goosebumps. Ready, boss? Let's begin. Keep your high beams burning, my dark family, because out here on the midnight freight lines, the scales never close, and the road always collects its toll. My name is Harvey, and in the bitter, freezing winter of 1976, at exactly 45 minutes past 2 in the morning, I was pushing a massive Peterbilt tractor-trailer through the desolate, snow-choked pine forests of northern Michigan. The night was an absolute wall of whiteout conditions, the kind of sub-zero chill that makes the metal frame of a cab groan and crack like brittle bone. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the wet, heavy sleet, leaving thick, jagged sheets of ice creeping inward from the rubber gaskets. Inside the cab, the heater blew a faint, lukewarm breath against my frozen knuckles, but it couldn't touch the deep, biting frost radiating from the floorboards. The air inside the cramped space smelled heavily of cheap black coffee grounds, stale cigarette smoke, and a pungent, chemical reek that seemed to be leaking right through the firewall from the cargo box behind me, a sharp, stinging odor of industrial formalin that burned the inside of my nostrils and made my eyes water behind my heavy-framed aviator glasses. I had taken on a special, off-the-books run out of a decommissioned anatomical research lab tucked deep into the Upper Peninsula woods. The dispatcher had paid me in crisp, unrecorded $100 bills, slipping the thick envelope across a greasy wooden counter without making eye contact. His instructions had been chillingly precise: 5 long wooden crates loaded into the reefer box, classified strictly as medical wax statues for a university display. The absolute conditions of the manifest were clear: maintain the refrigeration unit below -40 degrees Fahrenheit at all times, keep the dual axles rolling without interruption, and under no circumstances should I ever look inside the crates. As I wrestled the massive steering wheel through another blinding gust of wind, the cooling unit in the trailer behind me let out a heavy, mechanical sigh, a low, rhythmic hum followed by a sharp, metallic ping of freezing condensation. Crack, ice snap. The temperature inside the box had to be Arctic, yet that sickly, sweet smell of preserved flesh and chemical rot kept bleeding through the thin aluminum insulation of the sleeper bulkhead, fouling the air I breathed. My fingers grew stiff and clumsy against the scarred plastic of the gear shift as the big diesel engine roared deep in the chassis, fighting the accumulating drifts of snow piled high across the interstate. I glanced down at the dashboard gauges, my eyes burning from the fatigue and the lingering sting of the formalin. The oil pressure was steady, but the refrigeration temperature gauge was flickering erratically, hovering dangerously close to freezing. If the cooling unit failed, the wax inside those crates would soften, and the quiet, heavy cargo I was hauling through the Michigan wilderness would start to shift, to thaw, and to remember what it was like to breathe. The heavy V8 diesel engine stuttered, coughing a cloud of black exhaust into the swirling snow before the temperature gauge plummeted to absolute zero. A sharp, piercing alarm shrieked from the reefer control panel on the dash, flashing a harsh crimson light across the dark cab. The cooling unit in the trailer had completely seized up, and without immediate repairs, 10 tons of frozen cargo would thaw in the middle of a midnight blizzard. I swore under my breath, slammed the transmission into neutral, and yanked the emergency air brake. The Peterbilt shuddered to a violent halt on the icy shoulder of Route 131, the dual tires hissing against the packed snow. I pulled my heavy black leather biker jacket tight across my chest, shoved my silver-framed aviator glasses firmly up the bridge of my nose, and grabbed the heavy-duty steel flashlight from the floorboard. Stepping out onto the running board, the sub-zero wind hit me like a wall of shattered glass, instantly freezing the moisture in my beard and numbing my exposed fingers. I crunched through the deep drifts toward the rear of the trailer, my breath pluming into thick white clouds in the beam of my flashlight. The heavy stainless steel latch of the left cargo door was crusted with a thick layer of blue-white frost. I struck it hard with the heavy metal base of the flashlight, shattering the ice, and threw the locking bar open with a loud, metallic clatter that echoed through the silent pine forest. The heavy doors swung outward, releasing a dense, freezing fog that smelled intensely of industrial formalin, copper, and dead tissue. I swept the bright beam of my light into the dark interior of the refrigerated box, illuminating 5 long, heavy wooden crates strapped securely to the aluminum floor with industrial chains. A thick layer of rime ice coated the exterior wood, but the second crate from the front had a jagged crack running down its side, through which a dark, viscous fluid was slowly leaking and freezing into a crimson trail. Stepping cautiously inside the freezing gloom, my boots sliding on the slick metal flooring, I approached the cracked crate. The lid wasn't nailed shut, it was secured with heavy brass latches that had been forced outward from the inside. With my heart hammering a violent, erratic rhythm against my ribs, I reached out with a trembling, grease-stained hand and flipped the top latch open. The lid creaked upward on rusted hinges, releasing a wave of super-cooled air that frosted my eyelashes instantly. Inside, resting upon a bed of shattered ice and chemical preservative, was a human body, pale, rigid, and completely coated in a translucent layer of medical wax. I stared down at it, the horror gripping my throat so tightly I couldn't draw a breath. These weren't medical statues. They were fresh corpses, harvested and sealed away in a grotesque mockery of preservation. Then, the dead eyes of the figure beneath the wax slowly snapped wide open. A pair of milky, unblinking pupils fixed directly onto mine with absolute, murderous intent. Before I could stumble backward, the corpse's frostbitten fingers, long, gray, and tipped with blackened nails, began to frantically claw and scratch at the inside of the wooden lid with a dry, splintering shriek, scratch, scree, scratch. I slammed the heavy wooden lid down, locked the brass latch with shaking hands, and threw the trailer doors shut just as a heavy, muffled fist hammered against the wood from the inside. I scrambled back to the cab, threw the Peterbilt into gear, and peeled out onto the dark highway, leaving the screaming woods behind in a cloud of snow and diesel smoke. Now listen to this story, boss, and pay close attention. Let's continue. My name is Walter, and back in the freezing autumn of 1982, at 12 minutes past 3, I was 10 hours deep into a grueling freight haul across rural Iowa. The night was choked by a thick sea fog rolling off cornfields on either side of Route 20, swallowing my headlights and reducing the world to a milky void. The cab of my Kenworth W900 felt like a claustrophobic submarine sinking through gray cotton. The diesel engine rumbled beneath the floorboards with a deep vibration that rattled loose change and sent a dull ache up through my lower back. The dashboard smelled stale, a toxic blend of burnt coffee, cherry air freshener, and the bitter tang of ozone. My eyes burned with dry fatigue, eyelids feeling lined with coarse sand from staring into the glare of the fog. To keep the crushing monotony at bay, I had the CB radio turned on, though the frequency had been dead for hours. There were no truckers chatting, just an endless wave of high-static white noise hissing through the mono speaker like a nest of vipers. I adjusted the volume knob with a grease-stained thumb, leaning my forehead against the cool glass as the 18-wheeler cleaved through the silent night. The green illumination of the speedometer dial cast a sickly emerald glow across my knuckles, highlighting deep grease and my aviator glasses. I was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that makes reality begin to blur and warp, turning fence posts into looming shadows. Then, the relentless static hiss cut out with a sharp, violent pop. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening. I blinked hard, pulling my eyes away from the fog to stare down at the silver transceiver. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was absolute, dead air. Then, cutting through the speaker with terrifying clarity, came human breathing, heavy, ragged, and wet, as if someone pressed their mouth against a microphone inside an airtight crypt. Hoo, huff, hoo. A cold shiver raced down my spine, piercing my flannel shirt and making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Channel 19, I muttered to the empty cab, my voice sounding small against the diesel roar. Who's playing games out here? No one answered immediately. The heavy breathing continued, rhythmic and deliberate, matching the deep thud of engine pistons. I reached out a trembling hand, intending to shut the thing off. Before my fingertips could touch the plastic dial, a voice broke through the speaker. It wasn't the gravelly drawl of a passing trucker, nor an automated weather band broadcast. It was a woman's voice, smooth, low, and terrifyingly intimate, speaking as though she sat directly on the passenger seat. "You're thinking about your second ex-wife again, Walter," the voice purred softly. "You're wondering if she still has that old photograph of you beside the wrecked Ford pickup in Des Moines back in '78. You're wondering if she ever misses the way your hands smelled like diesel." My breath caught violently in my throat. A wave of nausea hit me like a physical blow. I had never told a soul about that photograph, not a dispatcher, not a dock worker, not even the old priest. It was a memory locked away in the darkest corner of my mind. "What?" I choked out. "What the hell is this? Who's on this frequency?" The woman on the radio didn't answer. Instead, a soft, breathy chuckle slipped through the static. "License plate number 74-Delta Gamma 9, she continued, reciting the exact alphanumeric sequence bolted to my trailer. "And you've got 300 miles left before your heart gives out, Walter. You shouldn't have taken the detour past the old drainage ditch at mile marker 44. You let something follow you home into the fog." I slammed my palm down onto the mic button, desperate to scream back into the void. "Get off this channel. Identify yourself or I swear to God." I didn't get to finish the threat. The CB radio let out a deafening shriek of electronic feedback that blew the small glass fuse with a bright, blue flash of sparks. The emerald dashboard instruments flickered violently twice and died, plunging the interior into pitch-black darkness. The heavy engine didn't die, it kept roaring with a blind, mechanical fury, pulling the 18-wheeler deeper into the Iowa Sea fog as the invisible passenger in the back began to wake up. My hands tightened with a desperate, crushing grip on the thick plastic steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white, the cold grip completely slick with nervous sweat as the endless miles ticked away into the terrifying void of the open road. The cab was completely dark, the dead dashboard instruments offering no comfort or illumination against the suffocating blackness pressing in through the glass of the windshield. The heavy Kenworth plowed forward through the blinding Iowa fog, guided only by blind momentum and the steady, rhythmic roar of the big diesel engine beneath my feet. Every single nerve ending in my body was stretched to the absolute breaking point, screaming at me to jump, to bail out, to do anything to escape the creeping dread that had invaded the small space of my workspace. I could feel the phantom pressure of eyes watching me from the pitch-black corners of the cabin, the air growing thicker, heavier, and entirely devoid of oxygen with every passing second. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate rustle coming from directly behind my head, where the dark sleeping berth was separated from the cab by a heavy, tattered velvet curtain. Rustle, slide, drip. Something wet and heavy was shifting in the shadows behind me, exhaling a foul, freezing draft that smelled of river mud, stagnant water, and rotting autumn leaves. I stared rigidly ahead at the impenetrable fog, terrified to blink, terrified to move a single muscle, listening intently to the slow, agonizing crawl of whatever entity had hitched a ride in my sleeper compartment. "Who's there?" I choked out, my voice trembling violently in the empty, freezing cab while my foot mashed the dead floorboards. A cold, skeletal hand slipped slowly from behind the curtain, its gray fingers resting heavily and possessively on my right shoulder, sinking through my flannel shirt like iron hooks. The touch burned with an unnatural frost that instantly numbed my collarbone, sending sharp, shooting pains down the length of my spine. "You missed your turn, Walter," a voice whispered directly into my ear, ice-cold and dripping with wet earth, echoing like a dying wind through a tomb. "And now the route belongs to us." The air in the cab turned instantly glacial, my breath freezing on the inside of the glass as the weight on my shoulder grew heavier, pressing me down into the vinyl driver's seat like an anchor of solid lead. I tried to scream, but my lungs refused to cooperate, locked tight by a sudden, paralyzing terror that reached deep into my chest and squeezed the remaining life out of me. In the rearview mirror, cutting through the thick wall of gray fog behind us, a pair of blinding high-beam headlights suddenly flared to life, not following behind us, but shining out from the pitch-black interior of costumes and shadows within the sleeper berth itself, illuminating the rotting, featureless face pressed hard against the back of my neck. The Kenworth veered sharply off the edge of the asphalt, plunging into the dark, bottomless abyss of the Iowa ditch as the final screaming notes of the engine were swallowed by the endless night. My name is Ramon, and back in the suffocating, blistering heat of the summer of 1979, at exactly 10 minutes to 2 in the morning, I was pushing a heavy-duty International Harvester semi across the lawless, sun-baked dirt tracks of the New Mexico borderlands. The air inside the cab pressed against my chest like a physical weight, thick, stagnant, and punishingly hot, refusing to move even as the useless metal blades of the dashboard fan spun in endless, whining circles. Every breath tasted of dry alkaline dust and the sharp, chemical reek of boiling engine oil leaking continuously from a cracked crankcase gasket, burning the back of my throat. I wiped the heavy, stinging streams of salty sweat from my forehead with the back of a grease-stained forearm, my skin slick and crawling under the relentless heat. I was running off the books, hauling an unmarked, heavily weighted trailer across unauthorized border routes to dodge federal inspectors and state wait stations, knowing that a single breakdown out here meant absolute abandonment. My eyes burned from a combination of chronic exhaustion, blowing desert sand, and the constant strain of staring into the narrow amber cones cast by my aging headlamps, which barely cut through the wall of darkness ahead. The dashboard hummed with a low, vibrating groan, and the only sound breaking the dead silence of the arid wasteland was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the dual rear tires crunching over loose gravel and baked clay. The isolation out here felt absolute, a heavy pressure that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, whispering that nothing alive belonged in this dead expanse at this hour. As I navigated a sharp, winding descent through a dry arroyo, the massive semi suddenly lurched backward, dipping heavily as if the rear axles had dropped into a deep trench. A strange, sickening sensation rippled through the chassis, vibrating directly up through the steering column and into my palms, followed immediately by a distinct, wet grinding sound echoing from beneath the aluminum floorboards, a sickening crunching noise that sounded unmistakably like heavy stones grinding against splintered bone and broken cartilage. Crunch, snap, pop. Panic spiked instantly through my nervous system, cold and sharp despite the sweltering heat, making my stomach drop into a bottomless void. I slammed my foot onto the brake pedal, the air brakes hissing sharply as the heavy rig skidded to a halt in a billowing cloud of choking white dust. Idling in the suffocating quiet, my heart hammering a wild, frantic rhythm against my ribs, I stared out through the windshield into the impenetrable blackness of the desert night. The silence outside was suffocating, heavy with a terrible expectancy that made every second drag like an eternity. Something was trapped beneath the duals. Something organic. I reached down to the floorboard, my fingers wrapping around the cold, checkered grip of my steel-framed pistol, and clicked on my heavy-duty handheld flashlight before pushing open the creaking cab door and stepping out into the burning desert heat. The desert heat hit me like a physical wave the moment my boots touched the dry, cracked earth of the arroyo, the air tasting sharply of sulfur and ancient dust. Every inhalation burned the lining of my lungs, heavy and stagnant, as if the oxygen itself had been drained from the atmosphere long before I arrived, leaving behind a vacuum that made every breath feel insufficient. I kept my right hand firmly wrapped around the checkered grip of the pistol tucked into my waistband, my thumb resting on the cold steel hammer as I flicked on the heavy-duty flashlight, my knuckles white from the sheer pressure of my grip. The bright beam cut a sharp, trembling path through the billows of white dust still settling around the massive dual tires of the trailer, illuminating floating particles of ash and dead soil that danced frantically in the artificial light. The night was dead silent, save for the ticking of the cooling exhaust manifold and the low, ominous hum of the diesel engine idling a few yards away, vibrating through the ground beneath my soles like a slow, deliberate pulse that matched the frantic pounding inside my chest. I took a slow, agonizing breath, the dry air scratching my raw throat, and crept cautiously along the side of the towering aluminum trailer until I reached the massive rear wheels, every step feeling heavier than the last as the shadows seemed to lean inward, pressing against my shoulders. The smell hit me halfway there, a sickening, suffocating wave of copper, visceral warmth, and rotting meat that made my stomach heave violently, forcing me to swallow the bitter bile rising in my mouth while my eyes watered from the sheer pungency of the decay. I aimed the flashlight beam down beneath the steel chassis, sweeping the bright circle of light across the dirt between the giant rubber treads, my hands shaking so violently the light beam bounced wildly against the undercarriage. What I saw made the blood freeze instantly in my veins, pinning my feet to the ground with a paralyzing shock that locked every muscle in my body, turning my limbs into lead as a wave of absolute vertigo washed over me. Sprawled across the wide expanse of baked clay was a massive pool of dark, smoking blood that was still bubbling and spreading toward my boots, soaking into the dry soil with a wet, sucking sound that seemed amplified in the vast emptiness of the night. In the center of the crimson pool lay the crushed, unrecognizable remains of another trucker, his gray company uniform shredded to ribbons, his chest cavity entirely hollowed out as if torn apart from the inside, exposing bare bone and shredded tissue that glistened under the harsh glare. And crouching directly over the mangled corpse was something that defied every law of nature and biology, radiating a deep, oppressive cold that cut right through the surrounding desert heat, turning the air around it biting and frost-edged. It was a sprawling, hairless entity with elongated, spindly limbs that twitched with unnatural spasms, its pale, semi-translucent skin stretched tightly over a cage of jagged, protruding ribs that rose and fell with a sickening rhythm. Its head was turned sharply upward toward me, revealing two wide, lidless eyes that glowed with a sickening amber reflection in the flashlight beam, locked onto me with an intelligence that felt ancient, hungry, and entirely devoid of mercy, while a wide jaw dripped with fresh, dark gore. Before I could even yank the pistol from my waistband or utter a single desperate prayer, the creature let out a low, wet gurgle and lunged forward with blinding, terrifying speed. A pair of cold, elongated claws shot out from the darkness, wrapping around my right ankle with an iron grip that shattered bone, and dragged me screaming down into the blood-soaked dirt beneath the roaring truck. My name is Gary, and back in the freezing, dead of winter in 1984, at exactly 33 minutes past 3 in the morning, I was wrestling an overloaded flatbed rig down a desolate, winding stretch of interstate in rural Oregon. The night was an absolute abyss, choked by a freezing, miserable drizzle that turned the asphalt into a slick, black mirror and coated the surrounding evergreen trees in a heavy, glistening layer of ice. Outside the glass, the absolute darkness pressed inward against the cab with a tangible weight, swallowing the feeble reach of my high beams and leaving me entirely isolated in a moving cage of metal and shadow. The cab of my heavy-duty Mack truck was freezing, the worn-out heater core hissing feebly and blowing nothing more than lukewarm air against my numbed shins while frost crept inward along the bottom corners of the windshield. The interior smelled heavily of stale black coffee from a stained styrofoam cup resting in the vibrating cup holder, cheap menthol tobacco lingering in the cramped upholstery, and the bitter, metallic tang of burning clutch lining drifting up through the floorboards. My eyes felt like raw wounds in my skull, burning from 20 hours straight behind the wheel, my vision blurring around the edges as the hypnotic sweep of the windshield wipers ticked back and forth, swish, thump, swish, thump. I reached blindly toward the dashboard, my gloved fingers fumbling against the panel before clicking on the AM radio, searching desperately for any static-filled voice or faint music to keep the encroaching microsleep at bay, but found only hollow, echoing silence and white noise. I was hauling an unmanifested load of industrial steel girders secured tightly down with heavy chains, desperate to beat a mandatory delivery deadline before the upcoming mountain passes completely iced over and locked the entire route down. The massive steel cables holding the load clinked rhythmically against the metal bed with every dip in the road, a sharp, metallic percussion that echoed through my skull like a persistent headache. The digital dash display glowed a harsh, flickering green, casting a sickly light across my knuckles as I fought the wandering steering wheel through another tight, blind curve, my arms aching from the constant physical exertion of keeping the heavy rig aligned. Then, cutting through the heavy mist ahead, a pair of dull, blood-red neon lights flickered to life on the right shoulder of the highway, spelling out a rusted, hand-painted sign that made my blood run cold: "Way Station, all trucks must stop." I blinked hard several times, pressing the heels of my hands against my burning eyelids to ensure I wasn't hallucinating from sheer exhaustion, but the glowing red lettering remained fixed against the gloom. I slammed my foot onto the brake pedal, the air brake screaming in protest as the heavy flatbed skidded across the wet asphalt, sliding smoothly onto the concrete approach slab of a station that I knew for a fact had been permanently abandoned and demolished 5 years prior after a massive landslide. The massive digital LED scale readout embedded in the concrete flickered erratically, flashed a blinding crimson, and immediately began to lock onto my gross vehicle weight while a low, rhythmic hum began to vibrate straight up through the brake pedal and into the soles of my boots. The heavy Mack truck shuddered to a dead stop on the center of the concrete scale platform, the wet tires hissing against the rough surface as the engine idled with a deep, vibrating rumble that shook the entire chassis and rattled the loose change in the ashtray. The red neon sign above the small, concrete block office hissed and spat tiny sparks into the freezing drizzle, casting a harsh, bloody glow across the rain-slicked asphalt of the abandoned way station and illuminating the creeping tendrils of mist rolling across the empty lot, painting long, distorted shadows that twisted against the weathered walls. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my hands glued to the cold plastic steering wheel, staring out the rain-streaked windshield toward the dark, shuttered building while a cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck, chilling my skin despite the stale heat inside the cab. There were no other vehicles in the lot, no federal inspectors, no glowing highway patrol cruisers, just an oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on the metal roof of the cab with the force of a falling mountain, cutting off the rest of the world and making the air feel thin and stale in my lungs. Then, the massive digital LED weight display mounted on the roadside pole flickered violently, emitting a high-pitched, metallic whine that cut straight through the drone of the diesel engine and made my teeth ache from the sharp, vibrating frequency. The numbers started climbing. 20 tons, 40 tons, 80 tons. The glowing red digits spun upward with terrifying speed, spinning past any possible legal limit for a semi-truck until they locked hard on a number that made my breath catch in my throat: 1,000 tons. Before I could even process the impossible weight flashing on the board, a sickening metallic groan echoed from beneath the chassis, followed immediately by the sound of stressed steel snapping under unimaginable pressure and the sharp smell of scorched rubber mixing with the damp night air. The concrete scale platform cracked down the middle with a deafening snap that echoed across the empty highway, and the massive front tires of the Mack began to sink rapidly into the solid earth as if the ground beneath us had turned to quicksand, dragging the cab downward at a sickening angle. I threw myself against the passenger door, shoving the handle down with all my weight, and tumbled out into the freezing mud and rain, gasping for breath as the bitter water soaked instantly through my jacket and chilled me to the bone. As I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, clawing frantically through the wet gravel and gasping for air while my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I looked toward the small office building. The barred windows were suddenly pressed flat from the inside by dozens of pale, distorted human faces, dozens of dead truckers, their skin gray and waxy, their mouths stretched wide in silent, eternal screams as they clawed frantically against the glass, waiting to weigh the souls of the next driver foolish enough to stop. Pay close attention, boss, because this story is very strange. My name is Gary, and I was still crawling on my hands and knees through the freezing, ankle-deep mud of the abandoned way station, the icy Oregon rain stinging my raw skin and soaking straight through the thick wool of my flannel shirt. Behind me, the massive Mack truck, my livelihood, my home for the last 5 years, and 3 tons of screaming steel, was sinking slowly into the shattered concrete scale platform as if the earth itself had opened up to swallow it whole. The digital LED readout on the roadside pole continued to burn a harsh, blinding crimson, locked permanently on that impossible, terrifying number, 1,000 tons. The air around me grew instantly thick and heavy, dropping in temperature so fast that my breath froze into jagged crystals on my lips. The rain falling through the eerie, red neon glow of the overhead sign didn't splash against the mud anymore, it turned into thick, viscous drops of black oil that stained everything they touched. I scrambled backward until my spine slammed hard against the cold, rusted chain-link fence that bordered the perimeter of the lot, my fingers clawing desperately at the wire mesh as I tried to push myself even further away from the dying truck. The cab of the Mack was nearly halfway swallowed by the earth now, the front bumper scraping against the jagged edges of broken concrete, sending up showers of bright blue electrical sparks that sizzled and died in the freezing puddles. Then, the agonizing roar of the diesel engine was abruptly cut short with a wet, metallic cough, followed by a deafening crack as the chassis snapped cleanly in half under the unbearable, crushing pressure. Silence descended upon the lot, a heavy, suffocating silence that felt entirely unnatural, broken only by the rhythmic, dripping sound of black oil splashing against the mud and the faint, high-pitched whine of dying electronics from the truck's dashboard. I squeezed my eyes shut, my chest heaving as I dragged cold, wet air into my burning lungs, praying to whatever God watched over the midnight highways that it was just a nightmare, that I would wake up in the sleeper berth with the engine idling peacefully outside of Portland. Tap. 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 The sound of slow, heavy footsteps echoed on the wet concrete just a few feet away from where I cowered against the fence. They weren't the squelching sound of boots in mud. They were the hard, hollow thuds of heavy leather heels striking pavement with deliberate, rhythmic precision, the exact sound of an inspector coming out to check your logbook at a mandatory weigh-in. I forced my eyes open, the freezing rain blurring my vision, and looked up. Standing directly over me, blocking out the sickly red neon glow of the sign, was a towering figure wearing a heavy, oil-stained company uniform from a freight line that had gone bankrupt back in the 1960s. The man, or whatever wore his shredded uniform, stood easily 7 feet tall, his shoulders unnaturally broad and rigid. He didn't have a face where a face should have been. Beneath the brim of his greasy captain's cap, there was only a smooth, pale expanse of taut, hairless skin, completely devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth, save for a jagged, horizontal slit stretched wide across the lower half of his head like an open ledger. Logbook, driver, a voice rasped from the slit, sounding like dry parchment scraping against rusted iron, vibrating directly inside my skull. You're overweight. You've been carrying the dead for 300 miles, and the toll has finally come due. Before I could scream, before I could raise my trembling hands to shield myself, 2 massive, gray-skinned arms reached down from the shadows. Cold, iron-like fingers wrapped around my throat and my ribs, lifting me effortlessly off the muddy ground as the asphalt beneath us split wide open, dragging me down into the endless, roaring dark where the scales never close. My name is Gary, though names don't matter much anymore down here where the asphalt ends and the endless dark begins, dissolving into a timeless void where the concept of tomorrow was stripped away long before my arrival. When the heavy, iron-like fingers of the faceless inspector wrapped around my throat and dragged me down through the splitting asphalt of the way station, the cold Oregon rain vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating, subterranean heat that smelled of scorching rubber, stale diesel exhaust, and centuries of dried blood baking under an unseen furnace. I fell for what felt like an eternity, tumbling headfirst through a pitch-black abyss where the shrieks of twisted metal and the haunting wails of 1,000 lost truckers echoed endlessly against invisible stone walls, vibrating straight through my skull until my thoughts fractured into jagged pieces. When I finally hit the ground, the impact didn't shatter my bones, Instead, I sank softly into a vast, sprawling plain of gray dust and crushed gravel that stretched out beneath a bruised, purple sky where no sun would ever rise, casting an eternal, sickly twilight across the desolate landscape. All around me, stretching as far as the eye could see across the dead horizon, stood the twisted, rusting skeletons of thousands of semi-trucks, every rig that had ever gone missing on the midnight routes, every driver who had ever missed a turn, every soul that had ever tried to cheat the highway scales only to be swallowed by the road. My old Mack truck was already there, its split chassis half buried in the ash, its headlights flickering weakly like dying fireflies in the heavy, chemical haze, weeping dark fluids into the barren soil while the wind whistled hollowly through its shattered windshield. A heavy, rhythmic thudding vibrated through the ground beneath my boots, slow and deliberate, matching the beat of a monstrous heart buried deep within the earth, pulsing with a terrible energy that kept the entire underworld locked in its eternal, agonizing grip. I looked up, and standing before me in the dim, sickly light was the towering, faceless figure in the oil-stained uniform, holding out a heavy, leather-bound ledger whose pages were written entirely in burning red ink that hissed softly against the dry air. "Your logbook is signed, driver," a dry, rasping voice echoed inside my mind, scraping against the walls of my consciousness as the jagged slit on the creature's face stretched into a wide, mocking grin that revealed rows of rusted metal spikes. "Welcome to the permanent hull. You're never going home." I turned around, looking back into the endless fog of the highway, knowing that somewhere up above, out on the dark and lonely stretches of Route 20, and Interstate 5, another naive soul was gripping a steering wheel, fighting off exhaustion, and listening to the dead static of a CB radio. The scales never close, my dark family. So keep your eyes on the road, keep your high beams burning, and pray you never hear the sound of someone calling your name across the static. Until the next midnight run, this is Disaster. Good night. Down here in the endless, ash-gray plains where the missing rigs come to rust, time doesn't move forward, it just loops like a worn-out cassette tape playing the exact same agonizing second of impact over and over again, locking us in a perpetual cycle of dread. I learned that truth quickly after the faceless inspector handed me the burning ledger, its hot ink searing a permanent mark into the palm of my hand that refuses to heal, throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache that matches the heartbeat of the underground wasteland. There are no clocks on the subterranean highway, only the perpetual, low-frequency hum of 1,000 diesel engines idling in neutral, their exhaust pipes belching thick clouds of black, chemical smoke into a sky that resembles a bruised and bleeding eye, casting a sickly, violet glare across the endless rows of battered metal. I walk the endless rows of dead iron every day, or what passes for a day when the horizon never changes color and the air tastes permanently of sulfur, dry rust, and burnt rubber that coats the back of my throat like ash. I pass Walter's Kenworth W900, its front bumper still smashed against the invisible concrete barrier of a ghost state line where the steering column is driven straight through the driver's seat, and Ramon's International Harvester, its tires melted flat into the scorched earth of a New Mexico that time forgot, the glass of its windshield completely caked in a thick, dried layer of dark blood. We are all part of the fleet now, bound to the asphalt by invisible chains of rubber and rust, condemned to wander a highway that leads nowhere and everywhere all at once, forever trapped in the deafening silence of our own final moments. Every now and then, when the atmospheric pressure drops and the heavy chemical haze thins out just a fraction, revealing jagged silhouettes of phantom mountains in the distance, the static begins, growing louder and more insistent with every passing minute. It doesn't come from a CB radio down here, it vibrates straight up through the soles of our boots, rattling our teeth and hissing through the empty air like a nest of angry vipers, crackle, static, sending a cold shiver down the spine of every trapped soul on the plain. That's when we stop walking. That's when every faceless driver, every lost soul, and every crushed phantom of the midnight run freezes in their tracks, turning their heads slowly toward the upper dark. Because we can hear them. Up there, floating across the mortal frequencies, a fresh voice is always cutting through the night, singing out a desperate tune against the overwhelming blackness of the empty highways. It's some tired kid in a beat-up Ford or some exhausted trucker staring through a rain-streaked windshield, trying to blink away the gritty sand of 20 hours behind the wheel, desperately turning a volume knob to keep the crushing silence at bay while his eyelids droop dangerously low. They think they're alone out there in the dark. They think the fog is just weather rolling in from the coast. They think the road belongs to them, a safe passage home to a warm bed and a waiting family. They don't know that every mile marker is a gravestone. They don't know that the static is us, whispering from the other side of the dial, waiting for them to miss a turn, waiting for their tires to drift across the shoulder, waiting for the exact moment their heart gives out and they join our permanent convoy. I stood beside the rusted hull of my old Mack truck today, staring up into the swirling vortex of gray mist that separates our endless plain from the living world above, listening to the faint, distant hum of tires spinning on wet asphalt miles above my head. I watched the red neon glow of a phantom way station flicker into existence miles away, casting its bloody light across the ash and illuminating the pale, staring faces of the other drivers who had gathered in the gloom to watch the sky. A familiar, high-pitched whine began to build in the air, vibrating through my chest as the digital LED numbers on the roadside pole started to spin upward once again, climbing past legal limits, climbing past reality, locking hard onto the next soul's weight. The scales are open, my dark family. Can you hear it? Right through the static, someone's calling your name. Keep your high beams burning, watch the blind spots, and never, ever answer when the radio speaks back. This is where the map ends. Not just the map of the living, but the final, tattered chart we all carry in our breast pockets, the logbook stained with coffee, sweat, and the grease of 100,000 lonely miles, worn thin by desperate thumbs tracing escape routes that never actually existed. Down here in the permanent dark, where the air tastes permanently of scorched asphalt and winter rain, the convoy finally stops moving, the endless rattling of diesel pistons finally fading into a hollow, echoing stillness that settles deep into the marrow of our bones. We've walked the ash plains past Walter's wrecked Kenworth and Ramon's burned-out International, our boots crunching softly over the infinite layers of gray dust and shattered glass that carpet this forgotten underworld. We've stood beneath the towering, bleeding neon of the way station where the digital numbers never stop climbing, locked forever at 1,000 tons of sorrow and steel while the high-pitched whine of the machinery drills straight through our skulls. There are no more detours to take, no more shortcuts through the cornfields to outrun the sunrise, and no more static-filled frequencies to tune on a dashboard radio that only plays the sound of our own dying gasps. Just the vast, echoing silence of a highway that stretches into infinity, paved with the broken promises of men who thought they could outdrive their own ghosts, believing their headlights could pierce a shadow that had already claimed them long before they turned the key in the ignition. I stood at the very edge of the asphalt tonight, looking out into the absolute void where the living world meets our endless graveyard, feeling the cold draft rising from the abyss below like a frozen breath against my neck. Far above us, piercing through the heavy, suffocating layers of fog and time, I could see it, a tiny, flickering point of amber light trembling against the wall of the night. It was just a single headlight cutting through the mist, bobbing along some forgotten interstate in Iowa or Oregon, belonging to some tired driver who had been awake too long, gripping a worn plastic steering wheel with white knuckles and listening to the dead hiss of a CB radio while the cabin heater rattled uselessly against the chill. They were humming along to a song they couldn't quite remember, blinking hard against the gritty sand in their eyes, entirely unaware that the shoulder of the road was beginning to dissolve into shadow and that the guardrails had quietly vanished into the dark. I didn't whisper through the static this time. I didn't need to, because the highway itself was already calling to them, whispering promises of a warm bed and a quiet exit just around the next blind curve. Because down here, we all know how the journey ends. You can check your mirrors 1,000 times until your eyes bleed, you can keep your high beams burning until the filaments melt and snap, and you can pray to whatever saint watches over the midnight shifts until your voice turns to dry ash. It doesn't change the destination. The engine always dies when you least expect it. The brakes always fail when the weight gets too heavy. And the scales always balance out in the end, collecting what the road is owed. The road belongs to the dark now, and the toll has been paid in full by every shattered soul that ever dared to cross the county line after midnight. So lock your doors, keep your eyes fixed straight ahead on the pale strip of fading white paint, and don't you dare look in the rearview mirror. They tell you that when a journey reaches its final mile, the engine falls silent and the wheels stop turning forever, letting you finally rest in a deep, undisturbed sleep beneath the quiet earth. They lie, painting pretty fairy tales for the living to keep them from realizing the horrifying truth of what waits out there in the empty expanses between towns. Out here on the other side of the static, where the asphalt dissolves into an endless ocean of gray dust and bruised twilight under a sky that refuses to change, the convoy never truly rests, condemned to move through an eternal limbo of burning fuel and phantom miles. We are the infrastructure now, the rusted guardrails bending over empty drops, the cracked concrete slabs holding up weightless bridges, the phantom shadows flickering just beyond the edge of your high beams when you take a blind curve too fast on a rainy Tuesday night and feel your tires slip for a fraction of a second. I looked back down the endless line of dead iron today, watching the 1,000-ton scales pulse with their sickening crimson heartbeat, casting a bloody reflection across the thousands of shattered windshields stretching out toward the blind horizon. Walter was leaning against the shattered grill of his Kenworth, smoking a cigarette that produced no smoke, just a wisp of cold mountain air that drifted upward into the heavy chemical haze, staring blankly into the middle distance where time had died decades ago. Ramon was staring out past the horizon where the New Mexico heat shimmers like broken glass, watching for a border that no longer exists, his hands permanently stained with the dark grease of his final, fatal breakdown. And I was standing right beside them, feeling the familiar, rhythmic vibration of the earth humming through the soles of my boots, a low, mechanical thud that matches the beat of every tired heart still pumping out there in the living world, keeping time with the grand, inescapable machinery of the highway. Because the highway is an eternal circle, my dark family, an endless, unbroken loop of consumption where nothing is ever truly lost, and every soul that wanders out into the midnight cold eventually feeds the machine. For every rig that slides off the shoulder and joins our permanent fleet down in the dark, another tired soul climbs into a cab somewhere out in the damp, freezing fog of Iowa or the lonely, forgotten stretches of Route 20, turning the key with shaking fingers. Another driver reaches out with a grease-stained thumb to click the CB radio dial, hunting for a friendly voice, a highway patrol warning about black ice, or just a distraction to keep the crushing, suffocating exhaustion at bay while his eyelids grow heavy as lead. They turn the volume knob. They listen to the high-static white noise hissing through the mono speaker like a nest of angry vipers, filling the cramped cabin with a harsh, abrasive sound that feels alive. And they don't realize that they aren't listening to the weather at all, nor are they picking up random signals from distant truckers bouncing across the ionosphere. They're listening to us. We are the static humming on Channel 19, a chorus of 1,000 dead voices whispering through the electrical current. We are the cold draft whispering through the velvet curtain of the sleeper berth when all the windows are rolled tightly shut. We are the sudden, unnatural shadow in the rearview mirror when you're 3 days without sleep and the white lines on the road start to blur together into one continuous stream of white fire. The journey doesn't end when the truck goes off the road, and it doesn't stop when the metal crumples against the canyon floor. It just changes frequencies, tuning into a dark, invisible broadcast that never goes off the air. So the next time you're out there on the midnight freight lines, pushing through the heavy sea fog with your eyes burning and your knuckles locked white around the steering wheel as the miles drag on into infinity, listen closely to the empty air. If you hear a soft, familiar voice calling your name across the dead air, mimicking the tone of someone you left behind years ago, don't answer. Don't touch the mic, don't tap the dashboard, and don't look over to the empty passenger seat. Keep your eyes fixed straight ahead on the pale line of the vanishing road. Keep your high beams burning against the encroaching wall of shadows, and pray to whatever gods watch over the night shifts that your brakes hold when the scales begin to glow red. This is the end of the line, where the final mile marker fades into mist and the tired hum of the engine settles into profound silence, wrapping around the frame like a shroud. We have driven every desolate highway from the frozen plains of Oregon to the scorching borderlands of New Mexico, navigating blinding sea fog, slipping on invisible black ice, and answering hollow calls across the dead static of Channel 19 as the night closed in. We've watched digital way station LEDs glow merciless crimson, locked permanently at 1,000 tons of sorrow and twisted steel while concrete platforms cracked beneath the impossible weight of our final sins. We've walked endless ash plains alongside Walter's wrecked Kenworth and Ramon's burned-out International, becoming a permanent part of the rusted convoy patrolling the shadowy border between living and dead, bound by chains of rubber and rust that time can never break. Standing at the edge of the digital horizon where asphalt dissolves into nothingness and bruised purple skies meet gray dust, the final transmission is ready to broadcast into the void. People ask why I keep telling these stories, digging up buried horrors that most prefer leaving forgotten in deep ditches of rural interstates. Why spend nights diving into dark corners of the human psyche, dragging up tales of lonely truckers, phantom way stations, and things riding in back seats through freezing dark while the world sleeps soundly behind locked doors? Why obsess over the cold, mechanical hum of an 18-wheeler tearing through midnight silence when the world outside is bright, loud, and full of ordinary life? The answer has always been right there in the static, waiting behind every crackle of white noise and every hiss of a dying radio tube. We are all drivers trying to make it through personal midnight runs, navigating twisting roads of our own fears when headlights barely pierce the fog of uncertainty. We all carry invisible loads in the back of our minds, wrestle with private ghosts haunting passenger seats, and stare down long stretches of isolation where destinations seem entirely lost in haze. We all look for voices in the dark to remind us we aren't completely alone out on desolate stretches of existence, that someone else is awake witnessing creeping shadows. That is what disaster has always been, built to be more than just a voice on a frequency or passing sound in the night. It is a gathering place for the midnight family, those finding comfort in shadows, preferring honest chills of ghost stories to hollow warmth of waking worlds, understanding quiet beauty of witching hours. Down here on the other side of the dial, the convoy is finally at peace, free from crushing pressure of delivery deadlines and federal inspectors. Engines idle in a rhythm that will never stop, vibrating through scorched earth with steady, comforting pulses matching underworld heartbeats. Dashboard lights glow eternal emerald against cracked glass, and roads stretch into magnificent infinity where curves never end and fog never lifts. We don't need to check rearview mirrors anymore, squinting through rain-streaked glass to see what lurks behind mud flaps. We don't fear weight of scales or sudden chill of back seats. We are the road now, woven into asphalt and gravel, belonging entirely to the dark. Up in the living world, journeys continue for the breathing, unsuspecting, and exhausted yet to take final turns off interstates. Somewhere on Route 20 right now, a tired kid grips a worn steering wheel with white knuckles, fighting crushing exhaustion as rain lashes windshields. Somewhere before dawn, a lonely soul turns a radio dial with a grease-stained thumb, listening to high-static white noise hiss like angry vipers, waiting for someone to speak across the void. They will find their way to our stretch of highway eventually, drawn by invisible pulls of dark and promises of quiet exits. When they do, another chapter opens, adding rigs to our unending line of iron. For the last time, my dark family, thank you for riding shotgun through fog, keeping high beams burning when night swallowed us whole, and staying until the very last mile. Lock doors against the cold, watch blind spots, and never answer when radios call your name. Until the next midnight run, this is disaster. Good night.